I work as an economic advisor at Narodowy Bank Polski. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Research Session 1, Economic and Institutional Resilience to Geopolitical Realignments. We have three insightful presentations lined up for this session, each followed by a discussion. Before we begin, let me provide you with several technical details. So each presenter is allocated 20 minutes of time. Then each discussant has 15 minutes. Following the discussion, we have the Q&A part, during which the audience and the panelists can ask their questions. As for the panelists, please use the raise hand option. I will unmute your microphone to ask the question during the Q&A part. And regarding the audience, please use the Q&A box to write your questions. I will collect them. I will select the most relevant and ask them on your behalf. After the Q&A part, we have the response of the presenter, which will take about 5 minutes. Fine, so let's now begin with the first presentation by Evgeny Skok, titled Foreign Exchange Regimes in Normal Times and Times of War.
Okay, hello everyone, and let me share my screen. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hello everyone, and thank you very much, Pavel, for your introduction. And big thank you to the organizers of the conference for this opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be here today and share results of our research. So my co-author and supervisor, Professor Oliver de Groot, leads this research project. And I'm very happy to assist him with this research. And this research about choice of the foreign exchange regime in normal times and times of war, which is based on the evidence from Ukraine. And this study about choice of exchange rate regime based on the state of the economy. So this is state contingent choice. And it's quite interesting in the sense that usually literature suggested that exchange rate regime choice, it's a one-time choice. But here, National Bank of Ukraine switched to from floating to fixed exchange rate regime and then return back to a floating, and it's quite interesting situation. And we tried to rationalize this decision and try to investigate it and to see what stands behind this, which policy trade-offs the National Bank of Ukraine faced. And on this particular plot, you can see that at the very first day of the invasion, the National Bank of Ukraine acted very quickly and immediately fixed exchange rate and keep it fixed more than a year and a half until October 2023. And despite the significant pressure on devaluation pressure on the national currency, the National Bank of Ukraine keep it fixed. And here the red line represents the official exchange rate, while blue line represents the shadow market rate, which is kind of the proxy for pressure on the exchange rate. So we tried to rationalize this decision, and for this purpose, we developed a stylized two-period open economy New Keynesian model with two frictions. One friction is in price setting, and another friction is in borrowing on international financial markets. And the key insight of the model is interaction between these frictions, because one friction tells us that, which is nominal price setting friction, it tells us that the National Bank of Ukraine should allow some kind of depreciation of the national currency by pursuing price stability in a country. But financial market friction tells that central bank should fix exchange rate to prevent a financial crisis. So this is how we model this, and results tells that a carefully calibrated, stylized model rationalizes the NBU decision to move to a fixed exchange rate. And in particular, model tells us that in the response to a small contractionary shock, it's efficient to pursue a fixed flexibility, where when to the optimal response to the large shock is such as invasion, is to fix exchange rate. So foreign exchange rate flexibility is not optimal anymore. And now let me move to methodology of this research and explain you briefly the model. So this is a small open economy model, Ukraine, which is a stylized and two-period New Keynesian model. There are households in the model, firms, banks, commercial banks, and the National Bank of Ukraine. So households in the model, they can work, they earn wage, and they borrow from banks, and they consume two kinds of goods, tradable and non-tradable goods. And the economy firms, they produce only non-tradable goods. And tradable goods, they're given as exogenous endowment. And this allows us to model the war as a tradable endowment shock. So it's a kind of a shock to income which country receives from trading on tradable goods. And banks, they borrow on international financial markets in USD, and they provide domestic loans in the national currency, and for this reason, they're exposed to and face currency risk. And the National Bank of Ukraine set the exchange rate. So in this model setting, this is a tool of the National Bank of Ukraine. And there are two frictions, as I mentioned, in firm price setting and in borrowing on international financial markets. So firm price setting friction tells us that only part of firms, they can adjust their prices in response to the shock in the first period. But all other firms, they can optimize their prices in the second period. And let me explain the financial frictions in terms of the banking sector. So first equation represents the bank's balance sheet, where here DT reflects the loans which banks provide to households. And these loans is equal to the sum of banks' networks and foreign borrowings, which is in USD, and they multiplied by the exchange rate. And the exchange rate here modeled as the ratio between between the domestic currency and foreign currency. So when exchange rate depreciates, then ET increases. Okay, and the banks also they face leverage constraint, and leverage constraint binds in case of significant shock. So when the shock is not significant and DT over NT remains smaller than leverage sale requirement, then in this case everything works fine. But once constraint binding, then commercial banks, they cannot borrow abroad anymore. Okay, and here is the equation 3 for the net worth, which is the difference from income received from domestic borrowing and expenses on borrowing on international financial markets. And from this equation, you can see that if we have a depreciation of the national currency, and then E0 going up, and this decreases the net worth. So in this case, when net worth is going down, it increases the possibility of receiving binding constraint. So this is one direction how constraint is getting bind. So when there is a significant increase in the exchange rate, then net worth going down and constraint binds. Another channel through which leverage constraint is binding is endowment shock. Since there is endowment shock on tradable goods, then households, they try to smooth their consumption and they want to have the same normal level of consumption, and for this reason they are borrowing more. So in this case, DT increases. And again, if they borrow more, it increases demand on imports and it leads to the currency depreciation. So these are two channels, how the financial friction works, and they're interconnected. Okay. So in terms of calibration, so we calibrate the model to meet empirical moments for Ukraine. Particularly, we calibrate to meet moments in a steady state, and we use data for 2021, and we calibrate the model in such a way that, to make sure that we match the ratio of tradable output to the total output, that we match the net foreign assets to GDP ratio, and the Ukraine banking system regulatory capital to net asset ratio. Then we set the interest rate at 10%, which is in line with the NBU key interest rate before the invasion. And we also use the fact that the tradable goods output contracted by 33% between 2021 and 2022. And we consider this in our model as a baseline crisis scenario. And we also provide robustness checks. We add correlated shocks, particularly risk premium shocks and non-tradable cost push shocks and substitutes consumption. Okay, and now let me move to the results of this study. So on the left plot, we can see exchange rate reaction to the tradable endowment shock here, and on the right plot, we can see welfare reflection on the tradable endowment shock. And 0 here is a steady state, and the vertical dashed line is a tradable endowment shock which Ukraine experienced in 2022. And let me start with the explanation of the model with only the nominal friction. So this the solid blue line reflects this model setting. So we don't have here financial friction. We can set freely exchange rate, and we have in the model only nominal friction. And as you can see, this line is downward sloping, which means that in response to the contractionary tradable endowment shock, the optimal policymaker depreciates exchange rate. And this allows to pursue price stability, since price is defined as the prices for non-tradable goods. So this is the optimal response. And in terms of welfare, this response delivers us a flat welfare curve. And welfare is calculated in comparison with the flexible price equilibrium here. So this is difference between what model with with nominal friction, with fixed prices tells us, and with a flexible price equilibrium. And since this is a flat, it tells us that under nominal friction and floating exchange rate, optimal policymaker can replicate the equilibrium with flexible prices. And it tells us also that a divine coincidence holds in this setting, because pursuing price stability, we can replicate the optimal allocation welfare. Okay, and then we add a fixed exchange rate regime to the nominal friction, and we are now under the yellow line with X mark. And so we see that this is flat line on the exchange rate plot. But we can see here that welfare is getting negative compared to the optimal flex price equilibrium in response to the tradable endowment shock. And you can see here if central bank fix exchange rate under different model setting, it's still not so optimal as in the case of flexible prices. Okay, and now let me move to the model when we have both frictions, nominal price setting friction and financial friction. And so this model optimal response reflected by the red line here. And you can see that if we have a negative endowment shock, optimal policymaker, the National Bank of Ukraine, should allow depreciation of exchange rate until some point. So in a response to a small shock, central bank should allow this depreciation of the national currency, and this king point is about 5% decline in a endowment shock. But when the shock is getting larger, then it's getting suboptimal for the policymaker to depreciate its exchange rate. And if you take a look on the situation when the National Bank of Ukraine was in 2022, when the tradable endowment shock was 33%, so we can see here that optimal policymaker should follow moderate appreciation, which is about 2%. And so this research outcome justifies and rationalize the National Bank of Ukraine decision on fixing exchange rate. Okay. So, and for the next exercise, we introduce the subsistence consumption. And this is the minimal level of consumption that should be ensured to people to survive, especially during hard times of war. And I personally think that this is a good extension and feature of this modeling setting. So subsistence consumption captures the importance of access, for example, to food and energy for human survival during the times of war. And equation 4 represents our baseline consumption aggregator, which depends on consumption of tradable and non-tradable goods. And here is a representation of the subsistence consumption into consumption aggregator. And we calibrate the share of subsistence consumption at 35% level of the aggregate steady state consumption. And let me move to results of this exercise. So imagine the situation when households are getting restricted in terms of their capacity to get energy and food and basic needs, and in this case, marginal utility getting more sensitive to changes in consumption, and exchange rate also reacts much stronger than in our baseline scenario. And since exchange rate reacts to these changes more significantly, we have a steeper curve for the model which reflects only nominal friction case. So we have steeper this curve, and as a result, the optimal central banker should deviate from depreciation of the exchange rate earlier than in a baseline scenario. Like according to the baseline scenario, this deviation should be somewhere at around 5% level, and now it's around 3.5% level of the tradable endowment shock. So, but still we see that it doesn't change the general outcome, in the sense that in response to the small shock, uh, optimal central bank allows some depreciation, but if a shock is large, it's getting suboptimal. Okay, and now let me move to concluding remarks. So our research question is whether the National Bank of Ukraine state contingent FX policy was optimal in 2022-23. And for this purpose, to investigate this question, we developed a stylized to period open economy new Keynesian model with a friction on nominal price setting and borrowing on international financial markets. And the interactions between these two frictions is a key insight of the model, because it allows us to model the trade-off which the National Bank of Ukraine faced when moved to a fixed exchange rate regime, in particular to allow exchange rate depreciation and focusing on price stability, or fixed exchange rate and prevent the financial crisis. And the results suggest that the National Bank of Ukraine decision was rational. So the model rationalizes this decision, and the optimal policy response to a small contractionary shock is to allow foreign exchange flexibility, whereas to the large contractionary shock, such as invasion, significant currency depreciation is suboptimal. So that is it from my side regarding the main part of the presentation. So let's move to the next part. Thank you.
Thank you for presentation and for perfect timekeeping. I now invite Ales Marshall to discuss Evgeny's paper.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me and for the opportunity to read the paper. I really enjoyed it. So I didn't know that the optimal exchange rate is state contingent, so it was really new. So can you just see my slides, hear me, all works? Perfect. Okay, so if I should, put the paper into one sentence, so basically it says that when the shocks are small float, when the shocks are war size, switch to peg, right? So it's just another way to say that, in a fancy way, that the exchange rate is state contingent. So in those remarks, in these remarks, I'm going to take 5 minutes to summarize the paper as I see it from my point of view. And then I will discuss some of the limitations and possible extensions of the analysis. Okay, so right, so the basic idea here is that when the shock hits the economy, so there is this standard new Keynesian channel that the shock distorts the relative prices in the economy. And the depreciation helps to restore the demand, so helps to counteract this dispersion, so dispersion losses. So for this reason, the floating is the optimal response. Here, the authors introduce another channel, which is also the balance sheet loss channel, and basically the idea is here that because of the FX mismatch on the bank sides, depreciation erodes the bank equity, and at some point the leverage cap starts binding, and the welfare collapses unless the FX is fixed. And the baseline threshold here is at 5% of the tradable output shock. So the idea here is that basically the price dispersion it's a nonlinear in inflation, but then in the utility function or in the welfare function, it's a linear in the price dispersion, and basically convex because of the leverage cap in the balance sheet. So for the small shocks, basically this part dominates. So it's optimal to float, and at some point, the balance sheet losses start dominate because of this stroke convexity, and the pack is optimal response. So although Evgeny really well explained actually the balance sheet loss channel, so but since this is the main channel, I have a recap on this. So basically, the idea here is that the banks need to fund some of the loans from abroad, and so they get the funding from in dollars, but they lend in hryvnia. So basically the currency assets are then the equity, the equity of the bank, plus the liabilities which are in USD. So that's why you multiply it by the exchange rate to convert it to hryvnia, right, to the domestic currency. And the idea here is that when the liabilities are predetermined. So when the shock hits, the banks already have their liabilities, which they need to pay back in the next period. And the liabilities are quite sizable here. So they are more than 11% of the GDP. So basically, the FX mismatch is pretty huge. So there is nothing like a hedging in the model. So it's just it's actually quite a huge FX exposure of the Ukrainian banks. So how then that works next? Because when the exchange rate depreciates, so this ET goes up. So basically, the F, which is the difference from this equation between the currency assets and the net worth. So it's weighted by the large number, right? So basically the idea here is that the net worth goes down because the liabilities go up because of the exchange rate depreciation, and it's wiping out the net equity. And there is basically introduced the exogenous leverage cap. So at some point, that is theta, since the net equity goes down, so it reaches this cap, and basically Ukraine or the banks in the economy are out of the international borrowing market, right? So, and because banks cannot borrow on the international markets to finance this desired borrowing of households, the households can no longer smooth the tradable consumption, and there is this large drop in the aggregate demand, which leads to these big welfare losses. Okay, so this is the main, quite nice, easy to understand figure where the main policy response is explained, right? So this king here is exactly when the leverage constraints are binding, right? So basically the optimal response in this framework for the central bank is to float when the leverage constraints are binding, swap to peg and follow the peg, right? So you can see it here, how to calculate the welfare from these policies. So the red line is the state contingent policy response, right? So you see that the welfare is higher than if you just peg from the very beginning. So what I'm missing here a little bit is the comparison to the float. So they don't have the welfare calculated, and you would be just keep floating, right? So the blue line is the way I interpret it is basically if there is, you can think about it, if all banks are financed just within the Ukraine, right? So they don't need to trade on the foreign markets, right? So that would be so in such a case, you would be able to not have any welfare losses, basically to be so the only friction would then be the nominal liquidities. Okay, so what are the strength and the limitation of this paper or this approach? So what I see is what I really enjoyed is actually that these two there's this two-period Ukrainian model. So the fact that authors focus only on two periods, so it makes everything closed form. The welfare is also closed form. It's just the additive function. So everything is super clear and super transparent in the model. So authors also calibrate the model to Ukrainian moments. They run the robustness on the risk premium and the substance of the tradable output. And it's the general equilibrium framework, so it fits to this IMF integrated policy framework. So at the same time, the strength are also the limitation actually of the approach, because since the model is really highly stylized, so and then there are only two periods, so authors have nothing to say about the shock propagation. Also, they assume perfect PEC credibility, and there is no, basically the Central Bank of Ukraine has in this case unlimited FX reserve, right? So it can never runs out of FX reserve to defend the currency. Just some ideas for like a minor, like not as important extensions. So in reality, there is usually also part of the trade is in the local currency pricing. So the banks are homogeneous here. So there's nothing like a state versus private banks. And also usually like some of the loans are hedged. So there is no hedged and unhedged part of the portfolio of loans, of foreigner loans. To say that is the limitations are more, I don't see as a big weakness of the model. It's more like just the possible extensions to check the robustness for. Okay, so for me, when I was reading it, I think most of the people who graduated in economics program, I used to deal with the infinite horizon model. So most of the thinking I did was how what are the benefits and what are the costs of this two-period framework. So basically, how you should think about the timing is that there is a time t0, which is the crisis when the shock hits, and then it's only 1 second period, basically the longer run, and So, and in the infinite horizon models, the choice today affects the infinite stream of the outcomes. So you don't have just basically the two period is that you have today, tomorrow, and after that the world ends, right? So how does it affect the price rigidity? So in this two-period model, the Calvo stickiness bites only in the t0 in the time 0, and all the firms can reset in times t equal to 1, right? In the second period, which is not the case in the infinite horizon model, right? When some of the firms cannot reset prices for very, very long. So in that way, this two periods model is shrinking or making the price dispersion small. So the cost coming from the price dispersions are lower in the two period environment than they would be in the infinite horizon, where the expected inflation feeds back into the Phillips curve. So also there is implication for policy. So in the two period world, the central bank's worry is only about current inflation. The period 1 price dispersion is 0 because indeed everyone reoptimizes. So how this affects the expectation channel? So in the two period, so we basically have just additive Euler equation. The firm's price setting has no forward term beyond the T1, unless in the infinite horizon when everything is in infinite sums, right? So as a result, you get what is nice. You get that these welfare effects became much more simple and more transparent in two periods, but it's at the cost of this real world inertia. So basically, mathematically, instead of infinite sums, you just deal with the sums. Yeah. So in terms of financial friction, it's the same story. So again, the leverage cap is evaluated only in times t0. When the shock hits, it vanishes in t equal to 1. So the past depreciation tightened credit for many periods in the infinite horizon on the other hand. So the implications are that the big depreciation today harms banks only once in the second period, but for years in the infinite horizon model. And for the policy optimization that the planet chooses basically here the single exchange rates to maximize the welfare over 2 periods, while in the infinite horizon, it must balance the full inflation output trade-offs over infinite horizons. Okay, so the takeaway intuition is basically that the 2 horizon extremely simplifies the model and allows the closed form solution. And if you would look like what would happen with these 2 channels in the nonlinear in the infinite horizon world, is that it affects those wedges in the same direction. So the price dispersion would be higher in the infinite horizon model, but also the bank leverage. So which wedge grows faster, and whether the same king survives, that would need a richer DSG model. So in this current model setting, the dispersion is actually convex in inflation, but linear in welfare. So if you look at just this locally on the small shocks, then the dispersion grows faster for small shocks than for than the balance sheet channel. So here, my guess, so I have some appendix discussion on the list, like when I try to be a little bit more analytical, but so I think if you move in the nonlinear DSG models, actually I have like the main message of my paper, which I presented actually in the Bank of Ukraine 2 years ago. So the main channel is that the price dispersion has a strong convexity in the nonlinear DSG models. So if the world is nonlinear, then the dispersion bites a lot. So it would be interesting to see in the infinite horizon nonlinear model if the story will still survive. Okay, so then the next I try to think how to so do some back of envelope calculation to check if the story presented in the paper holds, right? So the idea here was so you have the official exchange rate, right, and the shadow exchange rate. So the difference between these two I call the premium, and the idea here is that the peg must stabilize the inflation to avoid the large price dispersion, right? And it's only effective if the FX sales compress this shadow market premium, right? So what I do is that I calculate the premium. I download from the National Bank of Ukraine the size of the intervention, so how much US dollars they had to sell to protect the currency, to protect the peg. And and I take a look. So the interpretation would be if the beta is significantly below 0, so each USD sold reduces the premium. So so kind of the policy works. But if the B is close to 0 or statistically insignificant, the peg defense.
Alex, please try to wrap up.
Okay, so okay. So yeah. So basically, what I find out is that the beta is economically not significant, and so maybe authors should do a little bit. So it was just back of the envelope calculation, but the authors should look a little bit more into details on this if they can justify empirically their story. Yeah. So quickly, just 3 questions for the authors. So how big must the FX reserve be before the peg corner dominates? And another question would be, what happens if the if the liabilities would let's say be just a 5% of the GDP. And third question would be if the macroprudential policies could substitute for basically for the peg, right? Okay, so sorry for taking more time. I didn't realize.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So now we have the Q&A part, and I've got one interesting question here by Alexander Moskalenko, which is, given that the fixed exchange rate regime and subsequent currency depreciation disproportionately affect poorer households, particularly in wartime conditions, do you see a role for integrating household level inequality or distributional effects into your model? Okay, so now you have 3 minutes if you need to respond briefly to the points raised by Alesh and Alexandra.
First of all, Alesh, thank you so much for your insights. Good questions, and I should give you a credit for explaining the model. First of all, I see the room for the improvement. And so let me move to your questions one by one. So the first question was about the importance of the sustainability of international reserves before the moving to fixed exchange rate. And of course, this is a very important element of taking decision regarding moving to a fixed foreign exchange regime. And year of 2015 is a clear evidence for Ukraine, because in 2015 the National Bank of Ukraine had exhausted international reserves, couldn't support domestic currency with foreign exchange interventions, and moved to the floating exchange rate. And so, and this is quite risky, because you're in a situation when you can have free fall in depreciation of the domestic currency, in fact. And in our model, we assume that National Bank of Ukraine can maintain domestic currency and has capacities for this, but the model is abstract from the international reserves. Okay. And then we should also, from the practical viewpoint, we should also account another possibility of fixing exchange rate, not in a classical way when the central bank balance demand and supply and provide foreign exchange intervention, but in an administrative way, when the central bank just administratively says the exchange rate should be this, and then fixing it, but shut down the foreign exchange market or significantly restricted foreign exchange transactions. And that is what happened at the beginning of the invasion. So it doesn't require international reserves. Okay. Then there was a question regarding the share of foreign currency liabilities. Yeah, so if they are set at around 5% of GDP, maybe floating exchange rate regime is better than peg. So yeah, in this case, from our modeling perspective, the smaller the share of foreign currency liabilities, then the larger shock we would need to be for the financial friction to bind, if everything else is equal. So that is how it works. Then there were nice discussion, which I very like, about the infinite horizon New Keynesian model. Thank you for raising this question. And with Oliver, we were thinking about this, how to model. What is better, to use the stylized model with 2 periods, or use a standard infinite horizon New Keynesian model? But it was our conscious choice to use 2 periods and have a very tractable and show in a very tractable way policy trade-off which central bank faced. And we think that this approach holds a pedagogical outcome. Okay, and then there was a question about forward-looking capital buffer rules and FX-dependent risk weights. Okay, so in terms of the model, of course, affects the horizon when financial friction constraint binds. And this is very good insights, but I also like to bring Oliver viewpoint on this matter and in terms of international comparison. Like we can consider and compare the Brexit in this case, because during, of course, Brexit wasn't such a significant shock for the UK as invasion, but in terms of the advanced economies, it was still quite significant shock, and it was shock to the ability of the UK to trade with the EU. And we can model this shock in exactly the same manner, like a tradable endowment shock. But we see here the situation when one central bank allowed depreciation of the exchange rate, and in the UK it was 15% depreciation, which is quite large. And in another case, Ukrainian central bank fixed exchange rate, and and we think that the difference of the decision related to the exposure of financial system to the currency shock. And I think this is also a very good angle and insight from our research. So I'm thinking now I would be happy to address other questions, but I'm thinking I'm running out of time.
Yeah.
So again, thank you so much for very good insights and very cool questions.
Thank you for the great
Okay, thank you, Evgeny, for your response. Now we are moving on to the second paper titled Inputs in Distress, Geoeconomic Fragmentation and Firm Sourcing, which will be presented by Dennis Essas.
Yes, so I hope you can see my screen. Can you hear me as well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you very much to the organizers for including our paper in the program. And so this paper is all about the risks associated with disruptions to critical inputs in the context of growing trade fragmentation. So I think it fits very well with the theme of the conference. So as you can see, this is joint work with many co-authors at other central banks. And in fact, the list of contributors is so large that it barely fits the slide. And the reason for this is because this was originally conceived as a project by the Banca d'Italia and then got extended into a wider European project and actually a whole work stream, including data of 4 other European countries. So why this paper? Well, what motivates this research is really the growing attention to dependencies of Western economies on foreign inputs. We have all seen a series of large shocks rocking international supply chains of essential goods. Think about the mouth masks in COVID or later on the chips for cars. Also, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has led to disruptions in supply of several commodities. And in parallel, we have seen mounting geopolitical tensions. So not only between nowadays the US and the rest of the world, but also between the EU and China and in the Middle East. And together with this, we have seen the first signs and further risks of trade fragmentation, meaning trade being increasingly organized according to geopolitical lines. For example, we have seen China willing to weaponize its dominance in certain supply chains, like supply chains of rare earths, to use export controls to pressurize other economies. And so the natural question that arises is how disruptive would a broader sudden stop in the supply of foreign critical inputs be for Europe? So when we look at business surveys and other evidence like macro trade statistics, they all seem to point at China as one a key source of vulnerability. And here I show the results of a recent ECB survey of very large euro area firms. And so about 50% of these manufacturing firms or the firms that are in manufacturing, they indicate that they rely very heavily on imports from China, either through their own plants in China or through independent suppliers. They also indicate that the substitutability of these critical inputs are either very low or low. And so we will give special attention to China in this presentation. So what we do in this paper is actually to perform a supply risk assessment based on microdata. So we use administrative firm-level balance sheet and customs data of 5 EU countries: Belgium, France, Italy, Slovenia, and Spain. And we use it to quantify the value-added impact of a hypothetical cut in supply of certain foreign critical inputs from either China or China-aligned countries. And so in this presentation, I'll take you through 3 different steps. First, identify what are these foreign critical inputs. How do we choose which are the China-aligned countries? Second, present some stylized facts on the firms from these 5 countries that import foreign critical inputs, and then simulate the effect of such a supply cut using a tractable partial equilibrium model. So to be sure that I get across the most important points, here are my key takeaways. So the short-term impact of geo-fragmentation like supply cuts to critical inputs can be substantial, so multiple percentages of value added of the manufacturing sector. But the impact varies significantly, not only across countries, but also across regions, sectors, and even individual firms. And this is all driven by heterogeneous exposure of these individual firms. We also show that relying on macro data rather than micro data may bias the results, leading to either an overestimation or an underestimation of the shock impact. And I think then finally, we do believe that cross-country collaboration on micro data, as we have done in this paper, is really the way forward to better understanding and monitoring international supply chains. So we position our paper a little bit between 2 strands of the literature. So first, there's a large literature trying to map the exposures of countries, typically OECD countries or single countries, as well as single country firms. So for people that have access to firm level data, and they do so to highlight dependencies, but they do not really analyze the shock impacts. And then there's a whole other literature which really studies the impact of geo-economic fragmentation scenarios, mostly using general equilibrium models in the style of Bakai-Fari or Caliendo and Paro. And so that's all very well, but these models typically don't allow to model very granular shocks at product level and to also study outcomes of such very particular shocks. So how do we identify foreign critical inputs? So we classify imported goods at the 6-digit level as foreign critical inputs based on both intrinsic and extrinsic criteria. So first of all, we take input goods listed by the US Census Bureau as advanced technology products. So these are products used in areas like biotech, electronics, IT, and aerospace. We also use inputs and raw materials that are deemed crucial for the green transition, and we have a list of this based on OECD and other European work. Think about photovoltaic cells, think about lithium, nickel, copper, rare earths, but also batteries, permanent magnets, and so on. And then finally, there's also there's also other inputs and capital goods which may not list among technology products or products for the green transition, but are still marked by very high extra EU dependencies according to criteria of the Commission. So they basically look at the share of imports that come from outside the EU, as well as the concentration of these extra EU partners. And so in our baseline, we include in our list about 670 HS6 product codes, going from microchips to lithium batteries to insulin in the medical sector. Then we also need to, of course, identify China-aligned countries. And for this, we use a geopolitical index developed by ECB staff. So this is based on on 4 criteria, actually. First of all, the well-known UN voting patterns. on resolutions condemning the Russian invasion, also on whether military imports of countries mainly come from the US or China, on the frequency of sanctions by the US and China on particular countries, and on whether countries borrow a lot from China or not. And so we normalize these different indicators, we average them, and then if the index is above 0.75, then the country is considered China aligned. So obviously China is also China aligned. If it's below 0.25, then we would say the country is US or Western aligned, and everything in between, all countries in between, are considered neutral. And so based on macro data, we can calculate that for the whole of the EU, China accounted for about 30% of all extra EU import value of this list of foreign critical inputs. And it was also the main supplier for almost 1/3 of these products. And so then we go on to establish a number of stylized facts on firms importing these foreign critical inputs. So we do this by matching these product lists with firm level import data and balance sheet data for a single year, so pre-COVID 2019. And we find that we have in our sample 34,000 importers of foreign critical inputs in manufacturing. That's about 9% of all the manufacturing firms on which we have data, and that 20,000 firms do import these foreign critical inputs from China or China-aligned countries. And so based on this, we can derive a number of stylized facts. So first of all, these FCI importers account for a sizable share of the economy. So firms importing at least some foreign critical inputs account for about 70% of manufacturing value added. And if you look at just firms that import at least some foreign critical inputs from China-aligned countries, this is 55%. We also find that actually among firms, the share of exposed firms, so firms which would be exposed to shock in foreign critical inputs from China-aligned countries, that the share is higher for large firms, and that also large exposed firms account for most of the total exposed value added. So the top 1% largest firms with some exposure, they account for 70 to 96% of total exposed value added, depending on the country you look at. So this, we calculate this for all 5 countries. We also see that these foreign critical inputs, they only account for a modest share of total firm intermediate purchases. So 6% on average, but only 1% at the median. So that's really a skewed distribution. And we also see that it's actually even lower for foreign critical inputs from China-aligned countries. So it's not that these foreign critical inputs constitute very large values as such, but there are, of course, many firms that could be hit by a shock to those. We also find that the diversification of the sourcing of these products is rather limited, but it's a bit bigger, or so large importers are actually less vulnerable because they are more diversified. And so, for example, we find that only 10% of the firms buy the same foreign critical inputs from at least 2 or 3 countries. So most firms buy it from only one country. And then finally, using simple regressions and not at all claiming causality, we do find that importers of these foreign critical inputs, they are typically larger and more productive than other firms, even if we control for the industries they are at, and even if we compare them among firms that do import stuff from outside the EU. So how do we simulate a supply disruption of these foreign critical inputs? For this, we borrow actually the approach of Bachmann et al., which is this famous study estimating the costs to the German economy of cutting all energy imports from Russia. So they have a very simple production function approach next to their more general equilibrium work. So here, each firm produces output or has a turnover using Cobb-Douglas technology, where M are the intermediates, and these intermediates, goods and services, they exist of both foreign critical inputs, which is the E here, and then a bundle of non-foreign critical inputs also as other intermediates, and they combine them in a constant elasticity of substitution way, where the key parameter is, of course, this sigma, the elasticity of substitution between these foreign critical inputs and between other intermediates. And so then we assume that there's a firm-specific shock, epsilon, which reduces the availability of these foreign critical inputs. And with some simple manipulation, it can then be shown that the decline in value added, so the value added impact of a shock, is a closed form expression, where you do recognize the constant elasticity of substitution aggregator, and also this first factor 1 minus alpha minus beta, which is the ratio of expenditures on intermediates over turnover of the firm. And then, so this allows us to actually calculate a firm level value added impact, and this can then be aggregated using value added weights. So how important firms are in the manufacturing sector, even in the total economy, and we can do this over different samples. So either for the country aggregate, but also by region and by sector. And so I think at this point it's useful to think about what are the advantages and disadvantages of such an approach. Well, first of all, it can be calibrated with microdata that exists for many countries and tends to be available to researchers, especially central bank researchers. The model is computationally very fast because it's just a closed form expression. It's also very granular and it's very flexible. So these firm level results we find can be aggregated and diced up in many different ways. Of course, there are also caveats as always. This is really a partial equilibrium model, so we assume that prices and non-foreign critical input factors of production are held constant, which we think is a reasonable assumption over the very short term. So it should be really seen as a model of very short-term disruptions. We also abstract from indirect exposures, so from firms that are buying or are supplying the directly exposed firms. So we assume there's no propagation through the domestic network. Indeed, we know from Belgian data that indeed there are quite a number of firms which are indirectly exposed to such shocks. So it should be seen really as the tier 1 impact. We also abstract from adjustment through alternative domestic suppliers because we don't really have very good data at the same granularity of the domestic availability of these foreign critical inputs because the Prodcom data is not that harmonized as customs data is, and also is much more spotty than the customs data. So how do we calibrate the model? Well, we assume a firm specific shock, which exists of two components. What makes it firm specific is that every firm differs in the share of foreign critical inputs that they source from China or China-aligned country. And then we have this parameter delta, which captures the severity of this disruption and also the ease of substitution between different suppliers. So you could interpret a delta of 0.5, which is our baseline calibration, in two different ways. So first of all, you could think about a 100% cut in the supply of foreign critical inputs, but 50% being substituted with foreign critical inputs from elsewhere. Or you could just see it as a 50% cut in the supply of these goods without any substitution. And then the other parameters which are important is this gamma, which is the firm-specific share of intermediate spending on these foreign critical inputs. This we can calculate from customs and balance sheet data, so this differs for every single firm. And then we use sectoral data from OECD STAN because it's more harmonized about the ratio of intermediates over turnover. And then there's a central role for this elasticity of substitution, this sigma. And so theoretically, it can range from either 0 when it collapses to a Leontief production function, or to 1 when we would also assume Cobb-Douglas specification. But we think that lower values between 0 and 0.2 are more plausible for short-term calibrations. And we get this from the literature as well as the survey evidence I showed you earlier, that substitutability in the short term is very low. So these are our baseline effects. So it shows the impact of a 50% shock to FCI supplies for our 5 countries. And again, so the only FCI supplies from China-aligned countries, and it shows the impact or the change in total value added in the manufacturing sector for different values of elasticity of substitution. So if we assume that there's no substitutability at all, then the decline in the manufacturing value added lies between -2% for Belgium to more than -3% for Italy and Slovenia. So underlying these aggregate effects, we find very heterogeneous firm level effects, and this is just showing the distribution of the firm level effects, considering all firms to be equally important. And so we see it's really a bimodal distribution where you have a lot of firms which are hit moderately, which are typically the larger firms because they're more diversified, and then a number of smaller firms which are very experience very large shocks, which is the left tail here. And so then we can do a number of decompositions or different aggregations. So we see that if we decompose these baseline effects in according to the value added distribution of firms, we see that it's basically large firms driving the aggregate effects, even if they're more diversified, because they represent so much value added. The impact is really driven by them, and it also differs between countries. We see in Belgium, France, and Slovenia, the impact of these top 1% firms is even bigger because we have much more multinationals there than in other countries. We also see that the impact varies significantly across different manufacturing sectors. So these are the 5 most hit manufacturing sectors, and you see that even within the same sector, there are huge differences between countries. This depends on the subsectors that our countries are active in, and also on firm-specific sourcing patterns, which may differ between countries. You can also dice it up regionally, and then you see also that regions like northern Italy, Catalonia, and Antwerp, for example, in Belgium, would be more hit by such a shock. That's because they specialize in these sectors which use a lot of these FCIs from China-aligned countries, and they may also be home to very large exposed firms. So it's also where specific firms are located, which plays a big role. And then one final result in the paper is that we show that if you would do the same exercise but using sectoral data, so data collapsed into at the NACE 3 level, say, you can find huge differences. So here on the left-hand side, we simulated the impact of the same shock, but now using sectoral data, and on the right-hand side, you see the difference then between these sector level calibration and the firm level calibration. And you see that actually for most countries, the value added impact of the shock is overestimated when using more aggregate data, but you can also find simulations where the opposite is true. Why is this? Well, we show in the paper using very simple numerical examples that actually the size of the bias depends on 2 things: distribution of the value added weights of firms and also firm level exposures. So if very large firms, so in the firm level data, you may have very large firms which have very small exposure, and they dilute actually the effect. So that's actually what's happening in most of our countries. So let me conclude here. So what we do in the paper is identify vulnerable inputs and use a very simple tractable model to calibrate it with microdata to simulate the impact of a geofragmentation shock. we show that the impact can be substantial, but only actually if there are very strong complementarities, so very low substitutability in the production. This impact varies significantly across countries, across regions, sectors, and even individual firms within the same sector. And that's because the firms are very, the exposure of these firms is very heterogeneous. We also show that relying on more aggregated data may bias the results because you don't get the firm exposures and the importance these firms play in the economy, in the value added of the economy. You don't get it exactly right. And then in ongoing work, we're trying out different production function approaches. We're also looking at the panel dimension of our data. So now we're using a single year. And we're trying to also model the elasticities we have in the model more of data rather than assuming them exogenously. And we also may want to look at indirect exposures of firms through production network data that we, for example, have for Belgium. So thank you very much. And I hope I say this right, Jacques.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation, Dennis. I now invite Josh to share his comments on your paper.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
And can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let me make it full screen. All right. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very interesting paper. You know, usually when you submit a paper for a conference, you end up being a discussant. You wouldn't be very happy about it. But in this occasion, I'm actually very happy to discuss this relevant paper. Now, as Dennis already mentioned, there's a lot of co-authors, and I'm not able to include all of them into the screen, but at least the speaker is highlighted, and needless to say that this is only my view, not the view of the Bank of Lithuania or the Euro system. Okay, so let me begin with the summary of the paper. I think Dennis did a great job in terms of explaining the paper and the results, but I'll have to ask you to bear with me for a minute or so in terms of summarizing their work. So this paper is asking a very important and also timely question. To be more specific, the authors are asking, how would disruptions to the supply of foreign critical inputs, quote, unquote, FCI, might affect value added at different levels of aggregation in the euro area? Now, this is a very important question for multiple reasons. If you look at the real world events since, COVID-19, war in Ukraine, and this list is ongoing, that these real life events actually give very frequent and intense disruptions to the global trade, and in particular these critical inputs. But on the other hand, the governments in the world are not just sitting there doing nothing. And I'm listing a few policies here, which are also included in the paper by Dennis and co-authors, such as the US-China trade war, be it the first edition or the second edition. If we're looking at the bloc in Europe, there is Invest EU, Repower EU, and then on the other side of the pond, there is CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, which are giving firms massive subsidies so that they can be better incentivized to reshore their business back to the domestic market. And then if we look at China and the Far East, there was a lot of made in China or dual circulation or made in India that I wasn't able to include here. But with all that being said, this paper is trying to ask very timely and important questions, both to the policy crowd as well as to each one of us. Now, how do the authors answer this question? They leverage the institutions that they're sitting in. So first of all, they have firm level balance sheet information. Now, these are very granular information for all the firms that are under the survey, and they combine it with even granular data, which I believe is HS6-digit at product level data from these 5 EU countries, where the authors call them the BFISS. They leveraged this data and did a very decent exercise in terms of both empirical analysis as well as a partial equilibrium analytical framework to guide their quantitative results or implications. Now, the main takeaways of this exercise are the following. The short-term costs to the supply chain disruptions of these foreign critical inputs can be very substantial, right? Especially if those firms find it very hard to substitute away from those critical inputs. Now, this picture is quite heterogeneous if you aggregate these impacts either at the firm level, at the sectoral level, regional level, or country level, right? So overall, I find it very enjoyable to read this paper, and I learn a lot from their exercise. And I'm gonna organize my discussion in the following 3 sort of big groups. Right? The first one, I would focus a bit more on their empirical exercise, and in particular, I want to focus on the issue of identification. And then my second comment would be leaning toward their partial equilibrium analytical framework. And then I have some other thoughts, which I'll group them together toward the end of my discussion. Okay, so I'm copy pasting these small description directly from their paper, so allow me to read it out to all of you. The authors claim the advantage of granular data is that this aggregate shock can be combined with firms' heterogeneous exposure to FCIs to generate idiosyncratic shocks. These shift share shocks are then fed into our model to assess how geoeconomic fragmentation may affect firms, sectors, regions, and countries. And the way that I understand this, and also was described in the paper, is that these firm level shocks are noted as epsilon I, right? And these are essentially have 2 components. One is the China aligned share of these particular firm, and then the other one is the delta, where the authors vary this delta sort of to simulate scenarios where you have a small shock or you have a 50% reduction, which is a quite substantial shock, right? So just by reading the paper, it is not super clear to me whether the authors are really serious about this shift share approach. But if they are serious about such an identification strategy, the first thing I would do, as usual in this shift share literature, would be discuss the endogeneity concern if the authors only use a simple OLS regression, right? What could be the potential bias if they do not adopt such an identification strategy? And then, to the best of my knowledge, usually these kind of analysis requires a panel setting, or at least extend the data for 1 extra year, so that you have 2 periods, as in the famous China shock paper, in terms of these shift share exercise. Now, I think that this way of sort of dissecting these 2 parts are very nice, as the authors listed in their paper. But in the literature, there are actually a lot of debate between whether the shares being exogenous is sufficient, such as the Goldsmith, Pinkham, and co-authors paper, or the shift being exogenous is sufficient for identification, such as the Barusak and co-authors paper in 2022, right? So if the authors want to go this approach, I would recommend, for the benefit of the readers, provide a discussion or justification why certain view is more favorable in the current exercise. My reading, given the exercise that they are doing, it seems that they are leaning toward the shift being exogenous, because they can vary this by very large or different in magnitude, then my question would be, the size of BFISS, these 5 EU countries, if you add them up together, they're not that big as in China or India or the US, but they're not that small as in a country like Lithuania, right? So my question being, can you really just leveraging the size of the BFISS versus China allied economies to say that the shifts are exogenous? If it's not the case, I list a couple of papers here. The first paper is, I think, is utilizing maybe Norwegian data or maybe Belgium data. I forgot. Maybe you know this paper better than I do. They're leveraging a small open economies granular data sets, but they are able to use the shift to share exercise because they resort to the CEPI sort of global product level database to construct the exogenous shift. And similarly for this exercise by Barrows and Olivier, they're looking at India, which it's a quite large economy, but they are still resorting to this similar strategy as in this paper before to ensure the shifts are really exogenous. And then if you really want to do this in a proper way, in the most recent paper by Barusak and co-authors, they give you a list of a checklist of what should be implemented carefully step by step so that this approach is adopted in the most accurate and reasonable way. But with all that being said, I'm not able to tell whether the authors are serious about this kind of identification strategy. So the bottom line is, if you're not, please consider dropping this term, shift share shocks, or replace it with some other terms to avoid confusion for the readers. Okay? So that's my first point. My second point is related to the analytical framework, and I think Dennis did an excellent presentation of how they set up the problem. The key thing here is the Cobb-Douglas production function with intermediate inputs being a CES aggregation of the FCI and the non-FCI, following this approach by Bachmann and co-authors, right? So, and then when they carrying out their empirical exercise, this sigma is allowed to vary between the band of 0 and 0.2. Obviously, when it's 0, this is, in a sense, extremely not substitutable for the firms, hence the cost is quite substantial. But my worry from a theoretical perspective is that this sigma equal to 0 case, which is the Leontief case, is this internally consistent with fixed and non-zero shares in the Cobb-Douglas production function that you sort of set up right before the CES aggregation, right? Now, one way that I've been thinking about to justify your approach, it would be a common framework that is in the macro literature, which is the Putty-Clay approach. I list a couple of references for you to take a look. So essentially, they allow a Cobb-Douglas production function. These are fixed ex ante, and then later on, when it comes to the specific capital in this approach, right, they follow this Leontief production function. So my point is not, of course, these exercises are carried out in a general equilibrium framework. My point is not for you to change your partial equilibrium framework completely to adopt this general equilibrium approach. But perhaps you can argue the way that you carry out your exercise by saying, this is very similar to the Putty-Clay approach of production technology, which is, I think it's well known in the literature. Now, with that being said, even with the partial equilibrium framework, I believe you can still consider separating the FCI intensive sectors versus FCI non-intensive sectors within the manufacturing sector, right? And the reason being, the sigma might not be common across these sectors. And given that you only have one period you're playing with, I would not emphasize too much on the time varying nature of the elasticity of substitution. But then once you separate intensive versus non-intensive, that gives you room for embedding input-output linkage, which will enable you to explore the propagation of shocks and generate more accurate quantitative implications. Because at the moment, I feel these estimation or the results you obtain could be underestimating the potential propagation or the network effects coming from a bit more a micro-founded model. And then the other point I want to highlight is I feel like you could do a bit more, a bit better job in terms of strengthening the connection between the definition of the FCIs that you found them in the data and the partial equilibrium framework that you're utilizing for your quantitative exercise. And the reason being, some of the FCIs may be mainly affected via demand channel, while your framework is more well suited for a supply side disruption, right? So some discussions along those lines would be helpful. And then needless to say, there are some other mechanisms maybe you can discuss a bit when it's not included in your framework. And then I have some additional comments, but in the interest of time, I'll go through them fairly quickly. So I believe it's not too hard to extend the time horizon for one more period, right? And that will give you some interesting angles for you to see, such as extensive margin. It allows you to trace the firms, what happened to those that are more exposed to FCI. And then the customer's data, I believe you can differentiate between price versus quantity, which I think is important because it will give you different policy implications, whether it's coming from the price or coming from the actual trading goods. And then I feel you can do a bit more enriching of your exercise, be it cross-country or within country for cross sectors and cross regions. And then these exogenous variation of delta, perhaps you can link it a bit more closer to whether this is the real life events-driven or the policy-driven scenario. Okay, so with that, I'll wrap up. I think it's a super interesting and timely paper with very rich policy implications. I would at least sharpen the identification strategy of the empirical part, and I would defend the partial equilibrium framework with more discussions and consider possible extensions to have better quantitative implications if the selling point of the paper is more on the quantitative side. And I very much look forward to the next edition of the paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your discussion, Josh. We have one question that is asked by one participant, Ben Norman. So I will now read it quickly. Regarding the timeless in particular, could you see a case for the following analytical extension to split the world into three camps, China, US, and others, to reflect the priority of the US administration to ensure access to rare earth minerals? So yeah, this is the question by Ben. And now it's time for Dennis to provide us with a brief response to those points.
Yes. Thank you very much, Josh, for the very insightful comments and for reading the paper very, very intensively, judging from your discussion. So let me just go quickly over the main comments you had. First of all, a point about identification is very well taken, but indeed, as you suggested, in the end, I think maybe shift share shocks is it triggers all kinds of thoughts about the literature and identification and endogeneity with people. So maybe we should just drop it because indeed, I mean, I agree that if we would go further in really empirically estimating the impacts of such shocks, then really this is something we should definitely take care of and be very careful about. And thanks for all the references you put there. But I think analytically we can, I think, assume that we have an exogenous shock and to see what the effects are. China sells many of these foreign critical inputs to the rest of the world, and even so for a single European country, I would say it's still, you can consider the small open economy case. Then on the analytical framework, yes, we have thought a lot about, so more recently, about whether this very low substitutability is consistent with this Cobb-Douglas. And thanks for the reference to the Petit-Clay approach. I'm not very well versed in this, so I will check out the references. This is indeed something we are considering, maybe using also for this second stage, this integration with capital and labor, or domestic value more generally, to also use a CES function that would give us extra flexibility. We could basically shift the two parameters and see what the effects would be. That would also probably give much bigger effects than the ones we find now. Also, yeah, separating between sectors and looking at different values of sigma depending on the sector. Ideally, empirically based will be very interesting, I think. And then on the other comments, extending the time horizon, yes. For some central banks, it will be easier than others to construct like panels of firms using this data. Price versus quantity. Yes, you may know, I mean, the quantity, so we don't really have prices, you only have quantities and values. So you can calculate like unit values, but quantities are not often, the coverage is not always very helpful. Like for many products, you just have the kilos. So like say, I mean, a kilo of diamonds is not really a very helpful measure, or a kilo of chips, let's say. Sometimes you do have numbers, but not for all these critical inputs. So I think we could go in, probably not in this paper, but there would be a way to integrate better price versus quantity effects. And then yes, more discussion of this delta would be, I think, would also be needed. We were thinking actually of maybe including this example of Lithuania, because Lithuania was one of the countries which was hit by, say, an exogenous shock when they apparently offended the Chinese by recognize or calling the embassy the Taiwanese embassy. So yeah, I mean, most of the sanctions of China were, I think, on Lithuanian exports to China, but perhaps they also restricted some of the critical Chinese inputs to Lithuania. So that's maybe something we can look at. If you have any pointers on that, that would be great. Or even if you have data, that would be even better. And then the final question by Ben Norman. Yes, I think this framework is flexible enough to be extended. Yeah, you can simulate various scenarios. And indeed to have 3 blocks as well. One limitation is, of course, that it's really designed to simulate supply shocks. So let's say for the tariffs, for tariff shocks, which are probably more from the European side, more demand shocks, it's not the right framework, I would think. But still, it could be that also within this Western bloc there would be fragmentation, and that there would be also supply disruptions in this group, within this group. And so I think that indeed it can be extended depending on the scenario. Yeah, that was all from my side. Thanks again, Josh.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you for responding. So finally, we have the third paper in this session, which is Sanctions and Currencies in Global Credit, which will be presented by Marco Garofalo.
Excellent. Can I just make sure that everyone can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Marco.
Fantastic. All right. Let me full screen it. There we go. All right. Yeah, it's working. Okay. So thank you very much, the organizer, for including our paper in the program. This is joint work with Giovanni Rosso and Roger Vicheri, and the usual disclaimer applies. These are not the view of the Bank of England, his committees. So given the time, let me just jump right into it, and I don't think I need to motivate to this audience like why the dollar is such a important role in the international monetary financial system. We know it's the currency of central bank reserves and the treasury of safe assets, and there is also the vehicle currency of global trade, and also a lot of cross-border lending is denominated in USD. And this is exactly the kind of dollar dominance we are going to focus, and we're going to look at how sanction may affect this. Why financial sanctions? Well, there has been a lot of talk recently about how geopolitical interventions, like for example, the use of financial or international sanctions and the weaponization of the US dollar by the US may potentially affect the role of the dollar. And this is very much our research question. We look at how these sanctions may have affected the role of the dominance of the dollar in the global credit markets. And the answer, we find, is yes, it has happened. And given that a picture speaks 1,000 words, then let me just show you this one. I plotted here for you the BIS location banking data set. And this is total lending to Russia. And on the left-hand side, I put the level, so in billions. And as you can see, the total level has gone down over time after 2014, and so the introduction of sanctions on China following the invasion of Crimea. After, if you move to the right-hand side chart, you see that the reduction in overall lending is not the whole story. There has been a compositional shift in terms of currency of lending. So before 2014, most of the lending was in dollars, and after that, that has moved from around 60% to a bit more than 25%. And then right now, the latest data we got showed us that it was around 20%. And so a de-dollarization of international lending to Russia. And at the same time, this de-dollarization seems to have occurred at the same time as a euroization this time. So from 20% pre-2014, the share of euro-denominated lending has moved up to almost 50%. So this is very much our first contribution. We document this new starlight fact of de-dollarization in favor of euroization, and we actually show you using granular banking data for the UK-based global banks that these two phenomena are linked at the bank level. So the sanctions leading to a de-dollarization have then led to a euroization after the 2014 invasion of Crimea. And then we'll set up a very simple three-country model with three currencies where we model financial sanctions in a novel way. We show it that they have both a jurisdiction component and a currency-specific component. And this is in particular, the second one is gonna be key to match or get at least qualitatively close to what we see in the data. Okay, so let me just go skip this, but of course we speak to the literature on the international role of the dollar, and here we show that indeed the de-dollarizations and a switch to another dominant currency are indeed potentially possible through the geopolitical intervention like financial sanctions. And then on the, we speak also obviously to the strand of literature emerging one of the economic consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. And here we, there is a massive literature on that, but here we also contribute, among other things, with a new potential proposal for how to model this kind of effect when it comes to their effect on currency choice. Okay, so let me start with some data, then the facts, and then the model with the simulation is going to show you what I just said. Okay, so in terms of data, as I said, you really need to look at granular data here. And why? Because the aggregate one will not tell you the overall picture, and you will not be able to link the de-dollarization to the euroization, because this, like, the shock is at bank level, of course. So what we do, we use the Bank of England confidential quarterly panel of banks. These are consolidated balance sheet of these global banks in the City of London that have, and for those we can see lending to non-residents by asset, by country, and by currency, crucially for us. So this data set has already been used extensively in other research, but we are the first one to use it in the context of financial sanctions and the currency choice. And we have basically the universe of the UK resident banks. And why we think this is representative? Well, it has been shown in the literature that is representative. If I had to quote one stat, above all, because of the UK special role in the international financial system, actually the claims on UK resident banks are actually twice as large as the US-based banks on average. So we are talking about big numbers here. And then, so we are going to focus on claims, as most of the literature using this data set, and we're going to look at like a sample from 2010 to 2023, quarterly, more than 200 banks and 200 countries, and we group the currency into 4: pound, USD, euro, and a residual currency. So we have more than 30,000 unique combination of bank country and currency. Most of these banks are very big, so like it's not unusual for like most of the sample to be accounted by banks that like report every quarter. And because of, and there is of course going to be entry exit in this sample, and it's a bit hard to unfortunately identify most of the, as I said, the banks, they report every time, so it's not a problem that much. But of course, because they are reporting threshold, when a bank exit or enter, it's not necessarily the case that they've gone bankrupt or not. Okay, so let me give you some facts. As I said, like, I showed you the bigger picture with the BIS data. That's the global cross-border bank lending. But what we find there, we find it also in our subsample. So on the left-hand side, I plotted for you, I indexed for you the lending to Russia of my subsample of global banks in the UK. And as you can see, it has gone down dramatically, both as a level and as a share of total lending. And on the right-hand side, I plotted also the number of banks. Again, a lot of banks have exited, obviously, the market. So, like, in that sense, like sanctions have worked, because you have a decline in lending and decline in market participation. But then, as I said, if you go look under the bonnet of that, you'll find that there is a compositional shift in the currency accounting for this lending. In our subsample, again, everything is consistent with the general picture on the BIS. So we are not worried about, for example, like shifting across residency and nationality. But actually, you can see here for UK resident banks, the dollar share was even higher and then has dropped, and the euroization has come at the same time as in the aggregate data. And interestingly, this on the right-hand side, we plotted for like countries that have not been sanctioned ever, and you can see that like actually this shift doesn't happen there. So there's really something about the Sarracen, the financial sanction to it. Okay, so to really dive more into what is going on here, we decompose these changes in currency using a very simple framework. So on the left-hand side, we put the change in the share of the specific currency. Think of, for example, the dollar. And on the right-hand side, we divide the contribution from these three groups. The first one is like enters, so banks that were in the Russian market, so they were lending to Russia before 2014, and that weren't, and then that they entered the market after 2014. Then we have exeter, which are the other way around, so they were lending to Russia before 2014, and then they exit after that. And finally, what we call continuers, which were the banks that were lending to Russia, and they were still in the Russian market after 24. Yeah. So everything I'm gonna show you is gonna have like as a benchmark the 2013 Q4, so the quarter just before the Crimea invasion. Okay, and so this is what you get if you run this very simple intuitive decomposition. You get that on the left-hand side, the change in lending in dollars has gone down dramatically. And at the beginning, this is accounted for by continuous, so banks stay in the market by lending less. And at a certain point, then exit kicks in, so the pink bars that you see coming in from 2017. Like all of the story instead on the right-hand side, where you see the change in lending in euros, where has actually going up, so an euroization, and as I showed you before, and this increase is broadly speaking half into coming from continuers that are giving more euros and banks entering the market that weren't before. Okay, here I just skip this. This is just the pounds and the other currencies to say you that to show you that nothing much is going on here that unexpected. And what I really want to show you is that where the bank level granular data comes in. Like, because you have the bank level data, you can link like the banks that were on the left-hand side of my dollar chart, so the ones that were de-dollarizing, and you can see if those are the same one that were euroizing. Okay, and this you can't do with BA state, of course, because they're at country level. And what this picture shows you is that is exactly this like combination, is cross correlation. This combination, and what basically the main takeaway from this picture is that the blue bars, which is banks that de-dollarized, so they were continuous in dollars and they de-dollarized, and they were continuous in euros and they increased the euro, account for a lot of this increase in euros, but also banks that have de-dollarized, so continuous in USD, the yellow bars, that they have entered the EU market. So it's both margin, both extensive margin and intensive margin that the dollarization is bringing in the euroization. Okay, and finally, you may wonder, like, how does this change by jurisdiction? So like the nationality of the bank. Well, actually, what we find is that when we look at the ultimate ownership of the bank, we find that actually this euroization is quite broad-based. So even US banks have increased euro lending. Okay, and in this, in the remaining thing that I have, I wanted to briefly set up like this theoretical model that we had in mind to try to rationalize what's going on. It's on purpose very simple, three-country, three-currency model, where you have home is Russia, you can think of that as Russia, and then foreign is the US, and the rest of the world is W, where we just think of rest of the world currency as the euro. Okay, and in this world, there is just one asset, which is the perpetual bonds issued by so Russian firms, and but they can be issued in 3 different currencies, and these international financial intermediaries, they can hold all these different the same asset but in different currencies, and they finance this investment activity through deposit and net worth. And then actually I'm going to have, and everything is going to come from this non-absconding constraint, which is actually this very same leverage constraint that you saw in the first presentation, but just with a twist, because we have multiple assets. So I'll show you immediately what I mean with that, and then why we need that to model the different aspects of financial sanctions. So as I said, all action is from these financial intermediaries. They die in every period with a certain probability, and they return the net worth to their owners, but then they are born again in an equal number with a startup capital of X that comes from the same owners, they are financing themselves with the net worth and domestic deposits, so not international liabilities from in this simple model. And then you have their value, continuation value comes from just maximizing their discounted expected terminal net worth. The discount comes from the stochastic discount of the owner. And as I said, what is in this net worth? What is in this balance sheet? Well, what is in the balance sheet is this, the summation of the value converted, of course, using the real exchange rate here, this fancy Q here, of the three types of currency bonds. So home bond in home currency, home bond in foreign currency, and home bond in rest of the world currency. The difference is all action is gonna come from this constraint that is gonna be always binding. And as I said, like the leverage constraint says that this continuation value should not go lower than a fraction theta of this of the sum of this portfolio, because if it does, then like the banker runs away with this share. So you can immediately see how this constraint brings you steady state excess returns in each bond against the safe rate from the deposit, but that how the different excess returns are gonna be a function of this delta, which is a weight between 0 and 1 that is in front of each bond. So this is why is this very convenient, because you can already see that like the theta will govern the allocation across currency, the delta, while the theta will be a jurisdiction shock. So like an increase in this will tighten the overall constraint, and so the overall ending that goes down, as I showed you in the first chart. So you can model sanction both to obtain an overall decrease in lending, my first chart, and a shift across currency, my second status fact. Okay, this just repeats what I said. So sanction has both a credit shock, but also a risk shock, a currency specific settlement risk kind of shock. And finally, what I wanted to use this model for was to show you that if you think this is like a decent way of modeling the potential effect of financial sanction on international lending, and in particular their currency composition, what you can do something cool like this, which is, at least we think is very cool, is that you set a baseline for your excess returns on the different currency bonds. So the home bond, home currency is gonna have, say, 300 basis points on the deposit rate. The foreign one, which is the dollar one, is gonna have 100, so it's gonna be less risky. And the 150 basis points at the euro one. And then from the steady state, you just assume that perfect, I am almost done. You just assume that the delta F, which is the wedge on the dollar bond, suddenly goes up. So it becomes riskier for the settlement risk in dollars becomes riskier. So it's riskier to use dollars relative to, for example, euros. And we are in the process also to try to calibrate this properly with the syndicated loans. But just in a nutshell, what you get is that as you increase this risk, you have dollar share going down and euro share going up. And we find, for example, that like if you do it twofold, fourfold, and eightfold, the eightfold, this last one, you get you seem to approach the numbers that I show you in the first slide. So like a decrease of more than 30 percentage points, and an increase of 20 basis points. Okay, so I'm out of time, but let me just conclude. In this paper, we show you how US dollar hegemony in international credit markets may actually be affected by geopolitical intervention. And this is, in particular, we use the natural experiment actually of the financial sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, and we show you that this has led to a de-dollarization of lending to Russia, international lending to Russia, in favor of a euroization. And we create a novel free country model, which through this like jurisdiction specific and specific friction can rationalize what we see. And going forward, what we are looking to do is to analyze within bank spillovers. So if banks that have euroized versus Russia, they may euroize also to other countries, because it's, of course, that would change the role of the euro in international financial system. And then to microfound this financial friction as a risk premium, like again, using syndicated loans. I'll stop here, looking forward to Valerius' discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Marco. I now invite Valerio Nispilandi to discuss the paper.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, great. I would like to use the full screen, but okay, perfect. So good morning, everybody, and thank you so much to the organizers for having me. I'm Valerio Nispilandi, and I'm going to discuss this very nice paper. I'm from the Bank of Italy, so the usual disclaimer applies. And let's start with a summary of the paper in one slide. So the authors have both an empirical and a theoretical part. In the empirical part, they show that since 2014 Q1, which is the period when Russia invaded the Crimea, UK resident banks reduced their exposure to Russia. They decreased their share of dollar lending to Russia through the intensive margin, and they increased their share of euro lending to Russia through both an intensive and an extensive margin. And the extensive margin is the number of banks lending to Russian firms. So, and this is pretty interesting because it's not driven by similar trends in the liability side, nor by similar patterns that have occurred in the rest of the world. So this is suggesting that the main responsible for that is US sanctions, the effectiveness of US sanctions compared to the effectiveness of European Union sanctions. And then the authors rationalize these findings in a three-country DSG model with Gertler and Credi financial frictions, and the model can reconcile the results. So my general impression is that this is fascinating evidence, and actually I'm not pretty sure that the authors need a model to rationalize the results, but I'm gonna be more precise on that. And I have three main comments. So let's start with the empirical part. So I think the authors, I suggest the author to better explain the mechanism, giving a more detailed description of US sanctions. So to me, it's not fully clear what exactly prevented UK banks to lend dollar to Russian firms. Of course, the US government can forbid US firms to US banks to lend to Russia, but I mean the US government cannot do anything to prevent UK banks to do that. So I think this is very important to address this, and then it will be very interesting to understand whether this result is demand or supply driven. So are UK banks less willing to lend dollars to Russian firms, or is it the opposite? And one way to disentangle these two effects is to look at the response of the dollar interest rate on these claims. So of course, if the interest rate goes up, this means that UK banks would like to supply less dollar to Russian firms. But if it goes down, then the Russian borrowers would like to borrow less from UK banks. And then, well, this paper, of course, is an event study, so not a causal analysis. So the authors don't have an identification scheme that can. So they cannot say that sanctions are causing this pattern, the fact that the dollar lending has reduced while euro lending has increased in after the Russian invasion of Crimea. I mean, I am convinced. So I think that the explanation of the authors is very plausible, but I think more work is necessary to convince a bad referee that US sanctions are indeed responsible for these patterns. And the main reason is that, well, other events occurred in those years. For instance, the ECB QE in 2015. I also have to say that this, of course, still is very important. So the authors do show that similar patterns are occurring also in the rest of the world. So this, in a sense, pushes toward the explanation provided by the authors, and this is why I'm convinced by the author's interpretation of their findings. And then let's move to the model. So I'm not really sure that the authors need a model. So let me briefly summarize the model. So the financial side of the model. There are Russian households. They can borrow in ruble or in dollars or in euro from European banks and from US banks, which in turn can issue euro and dollar deposits respectively from European and the US households. And there is a gap and credit friction that is here between banks and Russian households. Now, first of all, this is a three-country model with GK frictions. So I usually work with this class of models, and even if you simplify it, well, I bet there are at least 50 equations. So the model, I think should be pretty big, and it is used to rationalize the results. And the authors indeed find in the model that US sanctions reduce the share of dollar lending by UK banks, and they they increase the share of euro lending by UK banks or by European banks. Here it doesn't matter. But my impression is that, well, you don't need 50 equations. I think any model would deliver this result if the following modified UAP condition holds. So this is credit supply equation that once you linearize the model, I think this equation also can be obtained in the model of the paper. So here in the left-hand side, there is the difference between lending by Western banks to Russian households in dollars minus lending by Western banks to Russian households in euro. So this is a credit supply equation, which depends, of course, on the excess return of dollar lending. So this is the dollar interest rate plus the expected appreciation of the dollar vis-a-vis the euro minus the euro interest rate minus the sanction shock. So here, when the dollar sanction shock goes up, the share of dollar lending should go down. And what's omega? So omega is a parameter that is in the appendix of the paper, but I think here it's crucial. So omega measures the inverse of the substitutability between dollar and euro assets. Here, omega in the model captures the bond adjustment cost. And so if omega is very, very low, then assets are perfect substitutes. So the adjustment after the shock should occur through quantities. If omega is very, very high, instead, these assets are not substituted at all, and the adjustment after the sanction shock should occur through interest rates. And this is crucial in their framework, because they are indeed, they want to quantify what happens here, what happens to the quantities. And so calibrating omega correctly is crucial, but it is crucial also for another reason. So suppose, so in my impression, I'm not sure about this, but my impression is that of course, for banks, these two assets are not perfect substitutes, because there is omega, there are omega captures bond adjustment cost, which means that banks cannot fully arbitrage between currency, between lending in dollar and lending in euro. But my impression is that Russian households can arbitrage between borrowing in dollar and borrowing in euro. But if they can do that, well, then this UIP condition should hold, right? So the dollar interest rate must be equal to the euro interest rate once you adjust for the expected depreciation. But then if this holds, then this equation that I showed you before, and I think this equation should hold in the model, becomes something like this. So, and omega is everything that matters in this equation. So depending on how you calibrate omega, then you can obtain whatever you want. So in order to quantify in order to use the model to quantify how much sanctions are effective, well, omega is crucial. And so let me conclude with some suggestions for the model on top of the omega. Again, if you want to keep the model, because I think that the paper can stand even without a model. So my impression is that, well, you don't need US banks, no ruble assets, so you can simplify further the framework. So the authors assume PPP, but this I'm not sure why. I mean, if you assume PPP in the model, then all consumption bundles are the same, and this implies that the real exchange rates are all equal to 1. I'm not sure if the authors want that. And the model doesn't have nominal rigidities, which is fine, but then I'm not sure whether nominal exchange rates are affected by the shock. So nominal exchange rates, without nominal rigidities, the nominal exchange rates are fully determined by monetary policy. So probably they are not affected by the sanction shock. So perhaps the others, should think about this if they like this implication. And then, well, we know that Russia is a small economy compared to the US and to the European Union, but the authors set the size of Russia to be the same as the size of the US and the European Union. This implies that in their model, the shock may have large macroeconomic effects for the US and the European Union, but in the real world, given that Russia is a small country, financial sanctions to Russia should not generate big macro implications for the US, for the euro area. And then, well, and then a possible extension, and I'm not sure if this can change somehow the results, if whether banks can also lend to foreign non-Russian households. So there could be some international spillover between banks. And that's it. So I think this is fascinating evidence on the effectiveness of sanctions. And I also believe that once more evidence is provided to support the sanction channel, the paper can stand even without the model. The results that the authors find are pretty intuitive, so I don't think they need a model or a very complicated model. But if you want to keep the model, well, the model can be further simplified or can also be used for other purposes. For instance, to study the effects of these sanctions on the Russian economy. And I'm done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valerio, for your insightful comment, keeping within the allocated time. Given the current delay, the organizers asked me to skip the Q&A part, so we are moving directly to the response by Marco.
Well, thank you very much, Valerio. This was a great discussion. So on your first point, absolutely, we are like the type of things we are thinking about next in terms of better explain the mechanism. We are focusing very much on it's not just about direct sanctions. It's very much about this secondary sanction risk that is going to affect the settlement risk in dollars as opposed to euro, where instead the EU is not a fan of secondary sanction or that the ones applied to the US on EU banks. So we are trying to disentangle to speak a bit more to that and using some further panel estimations where we are going to have treatment by jurisdiction and currency to speak to this, but it is definitely on our to-do list. On your point about disentangling demand and supply, unfortunately, the BOE banking dataset does not have interest rates on that lending, and that's why we're actually now looking at syndicated loans, because they account for a lot of cross-border lending anyway, and they do have that additional dimension. So we're going to use that to try to do something very similar to what we were suggesting. So point well taken. Thank you very much for mentioning that. And then on the accounting for other factors, again, that you're absolutely right, is a natural experiment, and we have UK recent data. So what we're going to do, what we are thinking doing again is to kind of broaden the panel and trying to for example, account for other potential shocks that may have affected all countries, not just Russia. So bringing also, for example, the other country dimension as well. And finally, on the model, I think, yes, that's a very well taken point. We really have to seriously think about where to keep it or not. But I really, really like your UIP condition point. So if you could send me the slide, I'll study it very well if I actually get there, because that would be such a nice, simple way to get there. And the main, you already understood what we wanted to do. The main thing was if we have a model, we can maybe think about spillovers. And because now we have now got new empirics on the spillover themselves, and they seem to be spillovers. So banks being more likely to denominate lending in euros to other countries. So, but nonetheless, we really have to think hard about whether we want to keep this model, because, as you said, it's not. We have simplified it maybe in the wrong way. We should simplify it more in the direction you said. And if it still is just not helpful, then we may just put not have it at all. But we'll think more about it. And thank you very much again for the discussion of the points.
Okay, so it's time to thank all the contributors: Evgeny, Alesh, Dennis, Josh, Valerio, and Marco for their works. And I would also like to thank the audience for the participation. And now it's time for the lunch break. Goodbye.
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 Thank you.